For that reason, we didn't really see this kind of coordinated fiscal response on a big scale that everybody was hoping for. So you can already begin to see some of the problems that began to emerge and that we're going to be dealing with as we begin to talk about the currency wars. All of this was really set up in this earlier period when the crisis hit and its immediate aftermath. Now, one of the interesting things about this, and I mentioned this briefly when I discussed the agenda for our session, is that the crisis also had a very important impact on global governance. And in particular, it solidified a move that was already beginning to take place to including emerging markets in discussions on how to resolve the problems of the world economy. Right? So historically, the G7 or the G8, the ministers would get together in a nice place where they have lots of good restaurants and wine and they could party. But now they decided that it had to be probably the G20. Because when you looked at countries like China, Brazil, India, Russia, they were becoming increasingly important in the world economy. So trying to address these sorts of issues without having those countries at the table was not going to be a very effective solution. So all the meetings that have taken place thus far that are aimed at trying to resolve these sorts of issues have now become G20 meetings. And we see these kinds of changes taking place in other subtle ways as well. So recently the IMF just announced that it was going to reform the voting shares that it gives to member countries. For a long time, emerging markets have been saying, look, we're a very big part of the world economy, and yet our voting shares don't reflect that. So the voting shares of developed countries are going down. Those of emerging markets are going up. In the WTO, we see emerging markets playing a much more forceful role in setting policy and policy discussions. So I think this reflects, as I said, one thing that countries like China were becoming much more important parts of the world economy. They were becoming assertive in a political sense. But it also reflects that, I think, a conviction that the United States was becoming less capable of leading the world economy, right? So in the past, when a crisis of this sort happened, Washington in particular would be at the center of efforts to remedy it. A lot of U.S. preferences were definitely put into policy. But now there was the belief that, well, the U.S. got us into this mess. Maybe they're not really capable of helping us to get out. So, there are a number of factors that I think were a big part of this. But I think this is a very important part, a very important moment in the history of the international economic system. And 10 or 15 years from now, I think we'll look back on these sets of events as being really a turning point in the history of the global economy. So I hope you'll remember that. So the big issues that countries began to grapple with as they sat down was that coming out of the crisis, there was low demand in developed countries that was contributing to slow growth. Employment dried up in many of these countries. The US, for instance, saw its unemployment rate go from 5% to close to 10%. Growth dropped in many countries in the developed world. Emerging markets suffered a sort of a slowdown, but quickly recovered. But it was very clear that the world economy was not growing at a rate that it had been growing before, and that it was capable of growing. We saw, again, the emergence of these very large imbalances that we saw before. So if we had data for 2009 onward, we would see that those imbalances continued to grow. They weren't shrinking. And people began to ask the question, could the world continue to tolerate the US running these huge deficits and sucking up all the capital that was available in the world economy? Would that mean that at some point the US economy would really falter? that the dollar would depreciate so much that it might collapse if people lost faith in the dollar. People became very worried, and they said, well, maybe in fact the world should be thinking about having a new monetary standard, right? Should the world economy still rely on the dollar as a reserve currency? So people began to question that quite explicitly. The Chinese, the head of the Chinese central bank went so far as to say, the dollar is done. We need to create a world currency. This is unsustainable in the long run. On the other hand, people began to say, can the world continue to tolerate China in other countries running these huge surpluses and sending all this money into the United States in particular, but also other countries, accumulating these huge reserves, right? So it's not just the problem of the United States, it's the problem of these other countries as well. So people began to question, is the Chinese model of export-oriented growth, is that sustainable for the long run? Can China continue to export its way to high growth at the expense of other countries in the world economy? And people became very concerned about the rise of protectionism, right? So far, protectionism has not been a horrible issue, but just a couple of weeks ago, the Brazilian finance minister said again, if we don't deal with the issues that we're talking about here, protectionism is bound to happen. So he said earlier we could have currency wars, now he's saying we might have trade wars. So he obviously likes this concept of war. So this led, in fact, to people to start talking about currency wars. And you know when The Economist has it on the front cover that its time has arrived, right? So the only reason I put this up is I really like this cover, and I'm sorry, I just thought it was an interesting topic. So let's talk a little bit about what currency wars are about. So I would say a lot of the currency wars really focus on the difficulties that have emerged between US and China on currency issues. So right now there's an intense debate that has been building for a number of years that centers on the value of the RMB, the Chinese currency. So the US for a long time now has been saying that China is manipulating the value of its currency, keeping it at an artificially low level in an effort to grow its exports and use that as a primary motor for its economic growth. And the US has argued, so has Japan, Germany, and many other countries, that this is patently unfair. Right? So they say if the Chinese currency were fairly valued, China would not have the sort of export success that it's having. It would leave room for other countries to tap into these markets and be able to sell their goods more. And we can see this by the fact that China has accumulated such extensive reserves that there's no economic justification for the level of reserves that it has. And it's continuing, acquisition of these reserves. And quite frankly, I think that except for a very few scholars, most people agree that this is in fact true. China, on the other hand, said, look, I'm sorry, but we're a poor country. We have a lot of people that we need to employ. We're just now beginning to emerge out of poverty in many instances. This is the only way that we can sustain the kind of economic growth that we need to pull up standards of living. And they've also said that if we began to do what you suggested, that there would be social unrest in China that could be really devastating for political and social order. So they said, we're going to move in that direction, but we're going to do so slowly, and you cannot push us to do this too quickly. China, on the other hand, said, well, the US, you're really doing something wrong too. You have an overly expansionary set of fiscal and monetary policies. And you are taking your medicine. You need to deflate your economy. You need to save more. You need to bring your budget deficit into balance. Otherwise, you're going to create problems. And the U.S. is saying, look, we just went through a horrible crisis, and unless